back of the rim. Got it! On the slam. Oh, here's a Curry way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry!
Let's be honest right off rip. You've forgotten about Damian Lillard. It wasn't of malicious intent, it wasn't for a lack of greatness, but if he's not hitting logo shots every week or talking about loyalty, he can easily slip your mind. It's for a few reasons. He's not really a controversial player, so nobody's constantly hating on him. He hasn't won almost anything significant in his career, so nobody's constantly defending his honor. But he's also stuck in the exact place he's been since his second year. No man's land. Let's take time to figure out exactly how that happened. Damian Lillard was a top 10 pick, drafted 6th overall, but he absolutely did not have the expectations to come in and immediately do the things that he did. Having spent the full 4 years in college, he was game ready as he proved against what was supposed to be the super team Lakers in just the first outing. It couldn't have been more fitting that his first career points came by way of what was an insanely deep 3 in 2012 and absolutely not yet the norm. By the time the night had finished, he tallied a confident 23 points to go with 11 assists and had immediately won over the hearts of Portland fans. It was clearly the start of something special as he'd break Steph Curry's rookie record for 3-pointers made in a year, while also unanimously winning Rookie of the Year despite being in the same class as a generational prospect in Anthony Davis. He was not, however, expected to take this roster to the playoffs in what was an especially brutal Western Conference, yet the vision was there. He and LaMarcus Aldridge could put a run together with the right pieces. Portland had never really known luck, drafting Sam Bowie over Michael Jordan, Greg Oden over Kevin Durant, and then losing out on the potential big three involving him, Aldridge, and Roy due to injury. Lillard and Aldridge were arising in the ashes of that failed team, and were almost immediately over-delivering. During that offseason, the Blazers would make some minor additions to the bench, one of which was a 6'3" guard drafted 10th overall, CJ McCollum. But opportunity would be sparse for him in the first year, and for good reason, as this previous 33-win Blazers team was now making the gargantuan jump to a 54-win record, tied for 4th seed behind Damian Lillard's first All-Star season. He and Aldridge led the way on a team that came fairly well equipped with shooters and defenders, causing us to ask, had Portland really made this jump to contention a single year after drafting their guy? Roy Hibbert seemed to think so, as he settled a small dispute with Aldridge on Twitter remarking, quote, "We'll see each other in the finals." The only issue was the thing that would become an issue during Lillard's career for the foreseeable future. No matter how good this Blazer unit was, they existed in the same standings as a veteran Spurs dynasty, a thought to be upcoming dynasty in OKC, the Clippers, who were always an inch away from domination, James Harden's Rockets, who they were neck and neck with, and plenty of more threats. In short, Portland could have been the 1st seed and still would not have been favored to scale that competition. However, during that year's first round against Houston, we'd get a glimpse into the future. Not only would Aldridge perform like an absolute superstar and a more than adequate dual partner for him to grow with, we would get our first instance of Dame time.
A 3 wins the series. It's Lillard. He got the shot off. Lillard, good! And the Blazers win the series for the first time in 14 years!
At that time, there had only been 4 previous series-winning walk-off shots in history. Ironically, this wouldn't even be his last. Not only not his last series winner, but far from his last clutch moment. Here he was, first playoff series, literally begging for the shot to send Houston home. There's also context that people forget surrounding this dagger. Houston was tied in the standings with Portland that year, but with this being Dwight Howard's first run alongside Harden, they had far higher expectations to do something special either that year or the next. Also remember, that was literally a game-deciding shot with Portland trailing. They'd had a 3-1 series lead at a point, and should they have lost, they would have been heading back to Houston for a tough-to-win Game 7. That was Dame's 23rd three-pointer of the series, in which he shot 49% from beyond the arc, 47% from the field, all whilst averaging 26, 6, and 6. They say the true mark of a superstar is when they can do it in the postseason, and if you didn't believe by now, you just didn't want to. Still, the problem. Right after squeaking by what was thought to be a potentially contending Rockets team, they were fed straight to a San Antonio team that was on an absolute mission to recoup that 2013 loss. There was no serious hope that it'd ever be a competitive series, and so it came and went. That was the exact moment Lillard's teams would receive what seems to be a permanent stamp. Good, but not great. Entertaining, yet aimless. If you needed any proof of that, the Blazers would enter the 2015 season with little to no significant additions to that roster, facing an even tougher Western Conference. The worst part of that, the biggest change there came in the Golden State Warriors, who were also an up-and-coming team, yet nowhere near on enough radars to predict the 67-win season they would spring on the world. Any team that wasn't injured from the previous year was contending, and the Grizzlies were legitimate again. Portland's 51-win season would only be good enough to place them 6th record-wise in seeding, and set them up to die against an extremely tough Memphis squad that was only one season removed from the conference finals. With the bevy of defenders Lillard would have thrown his way, he turned in a miserable shooting series as they were easily disposed of in a gentleman's sweep. Yet, the 2015 first round is not totally irrelevant to his story. As the season was winding down, 3-and-D guard Wesley Matthews would tear his Achilles, ending a consecutive streak of 250 games played. It's safe to say his role wasn't going anywhere, but in the tragedy, it cracked open the door for their 2013 draft pick CJ McCollum. Although it wouldn't be nearly enough to compete with the grit and grind, he'd averaged 17 points on 47% shooting that series after averaging a mere 6 throughout his second season. A game changer? No. Proof of concept? Absolutely, which they would sorely need considering the upcoming events. That summer, the Blazers would lose nearly everything they'd built in a short time. LaMarcus Aldridge skipped town to join the Spurs, which was monumental at the time. The Blazers would then lose their support pieces as Matthews and Batum would find new homes as well. This left the 2016 squad with what looked like a rebuilding team at worst and no shot at the Western Conference playoffs at best. Yet again, the problem. The ideal thing to happen at this point is the team becomes as bad as it is on paper, and they add significant talent through the draft because Portland had nothing coming in free agency. Nobody ever goes there. Instead, as demoed in that first round, CJ McCollum would become the legit number 2 option behind Lillard, as Damian himself would see his first 25-point per game scoring season with the added responsibility on offense. The result? Well, A, the Blazers definitely took a step back as expected, but were still able to squeeze out 44 wins. B, they were lucky enough for the West as a whole to have taken a step back, as that tally was enough to land them in the 5th seed. Just 1 year prior, 44 wins would have landed them in 10th. Still, none of this was necessarily good news. This Blazers roster was the definition of mid, and the distance between the contending and non-contending teams out west was a country mile. Specifically, Steph Curry and the Warriors were going nowhere, as after winning the championship, they'd breezed through 2016 with a 73-win record. It was unclear at the time how long this could go on given their relatively young core and lightning fast rise to success. It was the rise the Blazers seemed to be primed for in Lillard's sophomore season. This team would catch another break, first rounding a Clippers team they had no business competing with due to injury. Yet, just like 2014, once the feel-good story concluded, reality. They come face to face with what was actually a Curryless Warriors squad at the beginning of the series. This was enough leeway for them to eke out a game shortly before being packed up and sent away in 5. Game 4 there also showed what would become a recurring theme throughout their careers, the man-size gap between Lillard and Curry. In this case, Lillard could be great, but not Steph. No matter how many hot shooting nights he'd have, no matter how many shots he could hit that looked like Curry's, he was always destined to be a tier below. Which was unfortunate because the argument would begin to become that if Lillard had the help Steph had, he'd be able to do the same thing. Save that one for later. Things would get even worse as far as outlooks went. Although the Warriors were going to lose the finals, perhaps it would have been just better if they won it. Kevin Durant would join their core in July, and the gap between teams like the Warriors and Blazers went from a country mile to light years. Portland's roster remained nearly the exact same level of mid, and thus another season ensued of amazing basketball from Lillard at 27 points and 6 assists per game. Meanwhile, the team had fallen to 500. This was his 5th season in the league. He'd signed a 5-year extension in 2015. Remember that he technically got a late start in the league, so instead of being around 23 years of age, he was now beginning the slow march to 30. Outside of his rookie year, he'd not won anything to brag about, and as happens with any winless star early on, the rumbling started. Rumblings that were quickly shut down as for possibly the first time, we learned how he felt about super teams. On May 4th, 2017, he replied to a fan during a Q&A telling him he was willing to not win a title if he couldn't build it where he was. Quote, "This is the route I chose," he tweeted, and for 5 years running now, he stood tall on that. It was a rather interesting comment, as falling to a 500 team fighting for a tail-end playoff spot, he was on a collision course with the Warriors roster that had done the exact opposite in adding KD. It was one of the many times he'd make it known that he despised the new era of teaming up and, quote, running from the grind. Also save that one for later. It goes without saying that this Lillard and CJ duo was not nearly enough to compete with the Warriors, even if KD only appeared in 2 of the games. But pay attention, This was now the second year in a row this Warriors team was missing a star player for some time, and they still wiped the floor with the Blazers. Unlike the year before though, the Warriors didn't have that great of a supporting cast with KD out, given that they'd given up a good chunk to accommodate him on the roster. It's not that Portland should have been expected to beat them, not even close, but not even getting close in either situation just served to show how much distance there was between these situations. The Warriors would lose a single game on the way to their third straight finals and the title. Meanwhile, the Blazers were sent to another offseason with no clear path forward. This was the season it got really bad, and if we're being honest, in hindsight we can admit it's where the Blazers should have hung this experiment up. The roster was, once again, nearly the exact same type of mid, sans having use of Nurkic, who they'd added during the season before. Still, it was literally just Lillard and CJ leading a very forgettable cast, with their fate subject to what was happening around them in the conference. It is fair to mention though that behind the lack of additions, this franchise hadn't missed a postseason since Lillard's rookie year, and that'd be no different this time around, as a 49-win bid was enough to nab them the third seed, the highest they'd landed in his time there. Even with that, it was difficult to watch this situation unfold, as rather than let Harden toil with no superstar help, the Rockets would nab Chris Paul and become the best team in the league record-wise. Meanwhile, in the ashes of Durant's departure, OKC had gotten Westbrook both Paul George and Melo. Championship differences? Hardly in that economy, but at least a show of good faith to their star that had shown them loyalty. It was getting around that time that if they could not land any help, surely they'd consider cutting Lillard loose and restarting, as they clearly weren't getting anywhere from year to year. As it pertains to that, if there even needed to be a nail in the coffin, their comparatively good year was trashed by the Pelicans, who would sweep them in the first round. There was no life or energy to the team. There was nobody coming to the rescue in the near future. The cries to save Lillard were reaching their height. Meanwhile, Curry went on to repeat, and in that offseason, Golden State would add DeMarcus Cousins, even if it was just his corpse. But we didn't know that at the time. We didn't know what he was going to return as. And to add insult to injury, KD would tell CJ McCollum on his podcast not to worry about what goes on at the top. This coming as CJ had some things to say about how the rich were just getting richer.
Nah, you know how I felt, bro. I was hot. I don't know if I was more mad than when you went to go. I think I was more mad.
Why are you mad about this stuff?
Bro, I'm in the league. What do you mean? Why am I mad about this?
I mean,
I'm in the Western Conference. I got to play you MFers all the time anyway, as it is. Over and over again. We done got eliminated by y'all a few times in the first round. So I'm looking at Cuz.
I mean, you know you guys aren't going to win a championship.
He even publicly tweeted to DeMarcus Cousins about joining Golden State. It's pretty safe to assume Lillard felt the same way. On the topic of Curry and Lillard, it was a conversation that on the surface people were willing to have, because on one hand, Dame's individual talent and the lack of talent around him was apparent. If you'd have just swapped him with Steph, does Golden State miss a beat? There's a whole off-ball activity conversation that needs to be had there, but regardless, it was the bail people were willing to shoot him for a while. On the other hand, he was now willingly headed into year 7 with virtually the same type of roster he'd had since 2016, without an ounce of effort put towards actually constructing a contending squad. It was respectable to stay with the franchise and say you want to build with the city that took a chance on you, but where was the building? Despite the beyond disappointing first round exit, Lillard and CJ geared up for yet another year of tag teaming with mediocre support, once again overachieving by landing 3rd in the West with 53 wins. Perhaps by now you've noticed the pattern. Lillard, for essentially all of the 2010s by this point, had been fantastic individually. All NBA teams, all-star teams, top scorer in the league, and playoffs every single year. But on the flip side of that, all this time, he'd been doing just enough with CJ to justify not blowing the team up and trading everybody. Combine that with the fact that he himself wanted this, and Portland management showed with their action that they were fine with this result every year. And so came the 2019 playoffs, perhaps the worst case of this yet, because with the feats they'd pulled off, they'd buy themselves another couple of years of stagnation. First, there'd been a bit of chippiness between he and Russell Westbrook, let's address that. All in the spirit of competition, but chippiness nonetheless. So much so that Russ could be heard telling him one game, quote, "I've been busting your ass for years." Lillard may not have won much in his career, but one thing he could do was individually pack you up, and in this situation, he'd give the world an all-timer.
A chance to send the Thunder home. Lillard, long-range three.
So a couple couple of things here. Much like with the Rockets in 2014, the Blazers were more or less neck and neck with OKC in the standings. As a matter of fact, with Paul George boasting an MVP campaign that year, there would have been zero surprise if he and Westbrook sent Portland away. Speaking of which, it goes without saying that this pairing kind of symbolized exactly what Lillard was talking about, with guys teaming up and leaving their teams, maybe to a lesser degree than it was happening in the league at the time, but as we'd find out later, he thought it counted. And finally, this just added to the legend of Dame time. Not only had this been his second series walk-off shot, he was pretty much known to be a gamer by this point. He went for stretches leading the league in fourth quarter scoring, flat out carrying offenses in final minutes, and a stat tracked in 2021 read that he'd made 25 game-tying or go-ahead buckets in the final 20 seconds of the fourth quarter, more than anybody else since he'd entered the league. That he has two of the very few series buzzer beaters in history just attests to that, and is also one of the reasons that Curry and Lillard help debate would arise occasionally. With 50 points, 6 assists, 7 rebounds, and 3 steals to gentleman sweep the Thunder, whilst embarrassing his rival Westbrook in the process, he'd take Portland up against the second-seeded Nuggets, the round where they'd normally fizzle out. This had always been the time where whatever feel-good kick they were on from the first round would come to an end. And if it hadn't have been for CJ McCollum, it likely would have. Lillard, while scoring as usual, would go on to have a very tough shooting series by his standards, essentially allowing McCollum to lead the way and lead the series in scoring. By the hairs on their chins, they'd escape Denver in a 7-game upset to make their first Western Conference Finals of Lillard's career. You could see it on his face on the way back to the locker room. It was finally happening. Fans and media, aside from Charles Barkley, had deemed it flat out impossible to succeed with this team as currently constructed. Yet, here he was, now 4 wins away from the NBA Finals and facing a depleted Warriors team that wouldn't have Kevin Durant for the foreseeable future. Remember, that Warriors team, while having its core, was mostly employing a cast of random characters since they were paying for Durant. We knew they could pull off a game or so giving Alfonso McKinney legitimate minutes, but could they win 4 games like that? Yes, they could, and they did, brutally. Portland dropped a big lead in each of the 4 games they would lose, causing some to point out that if they had just had the ability to maintain their level of play, an NBA Finals berth was ever so faint in the distance. The sad fact was, there's just levels to this. Levels like Curry averaging a near 37-point triple-double in the series to Lillard's 22 points on 37%. Sure, the Warriors were still better, but with Curry doing this on a more level playing field, most of the world could stop taking those comparisons seriously. Lillard was great, but he was so very clearly a tier below, and that just needed to be accepted. Still, he somewhat miraculously had finally gotten this team to the doorstep, so why give up now after going all in on the bit? Well, because the Lakers got Anthony Davis, the Clippers got PG and Kawhi, the NBA was in its duo era, and the West was on its way back. What did Portland do that summer? Absolutely nothing worth mentioning. At this point, it was flat out insanity to run it back. But of course, not only had Lillard doubled down on his loyalty takes by this point, he was starting to get somewhat outwardly agitated about the choices of his peers. By the time the world fell apart and the NBA descended into the bubble, the Blazers really weren't a playoff team. They'd simply be given a chance to squeeze their way in. Excelling in these micro moments as he so often did, Lillard produced flat-out awe-inspiring plays, willing what was a beyond dead team to the postseason whilst winning the bubble MVP. This being one of the few awards he'd win in his career was a bit on the nose, but you had to admire the challenges he'd taken on by this point. Aside from his play, he'd been a focal point of the bubble for other reasons. Let's rewind a little bit. After being sent home by what is easily the most insane game winner in playoff history, Paul George, somewhat salty, remarked that it was a bad shot. Was he wrong? No. Do you say that minutes after being sent home by the shot? Also no. Meanwhile, back at the bubble nearly a year later, one of the games involved Lillard missing free throws that led to a loss against the Clippers. There was a lot of talking on the sidelines between PG and Pat Bev, and it spilled off court. Later on Instagram during the skirmish, Lillard would tell him, quote, "Keep switching teams, running from the grind. Running from the grind." That's been somewhat of a meme ever since, with fans often telling Dame himself to do so. After getting a single game off of the eventual champion Lakers, they were promptly returned to Cinder in 5, so that the process could start all over again. But running from the grind. Again, respectable not to do so, but also, Is willingly staying in a linear situation considered not running from it? This was around the time people began to point out that by putting no pressure on management to make moves or exploring other options himself, he was almost entirely avoiding the pressures of ever having to win anything other than a few first-round playoff series. By this point, he'd mentioned loyalty so much that it started to feel a bit annoying to fans, because you could tell he was bothered by Durant's move. You could tell he despised all of what happened with Golden State. He flat out told Paul George he disapproved of his moves. He could look down on his peers from his tower of loyalty, but perhaps it was time to acknowledge the difference between loyalty and loyalty to a fault. Either way, in 2021, all it led to was another painfully average year and his 5th first-round exit. Worth mentioning that he once again somewhat exceeded expectations, getting them to the playoffs at all in a year where CJ McCollum was mostly injured. But to this day, that's about as far as his accomplishments go. The Blazers are mid. They never miss the playoffs if he's healthy. First or second round exit, repeat. In 2022, that cycle finally broke as he entered the year looking all sorts of washed, which we could later attribute to an injury that required surgery. In his time away, the Blazers would finally trade CJ McCollum, possibly signaling the end of an era as a whole. Yet shortly after, they would commit to a quick rebuild around their guy, which brings us to present day. He said himself that some things are bigger than basketball. Some things are more important than winning championships. To Dame, playing basketball with the team that drafted him in Portland is more important than abandoning it in the name of a championship. As far as we know, that's where it ends. Every now and then we'll get a cryptic quote from him that feels like he's finally fed up, some bit of news that we finally reached a major breaking point, every now and then. But for a majority of the time, it's just a head scratcher. A great player, no doubt, who, by the way, could definitely have won championships in Steph's shoes, even if that doesn't make him as great or in the same tier. But a player and team that choose to stay in a situation that, at this point, makes no sense for either side. Had the Blazers had chosen to break up a short while ago when the bell rang, they'd be in position to draft an all-time prospect in 2022, and Lillard would probably be somewhere else contending. But for whatever reason, they both remain content with either runs that lead to the middle or end of the Western Conference that inevitably lead to second-round burnouts at best. However, the NBA itself is a weird story. Between injuries, trades, and chemistry, you never have a clue where a player's career is going. Dame still got time, but until something significant changes, all we'll get is Dame time.
Here's Lillard again from the logo. That's twice.
Lillard standstill three from the logo. Got it! Oh, from Aurora, way downtown.